accepted into service in 1935 and retired only in 1968. Just imagine, enviable longevity and a truly glorious destiny befell the English Anson aircraft, which served faithfully for over 30 years in the air forces of various countries around the world. Like many other famous combat aircraft of the 1930s, the Anson was not conceived as a military machine at all from the very beginning. It was a period of rapid development in aircraft construction. The concept of the cantilever monoplane was gradually becoming the generally accepted standard in both military and civil aviation. In various countries, passenger aircraft designed according to such a progressive scheme were just beginning to appear. In May 1933, the airline Imperial Airways approached the firm Avro Company, better known by its trademark Avro. The task was specific: to design a small high-speed machine for charter flights. By August of that same year, in the Avro Design Bureau in Manchester, chief designer Roy Chadwick set to work on fulfilling this order. The result of this work was the Avro 652 project, a twin-engine aircraft of mixed construction. Its wing and horizontal tail surfaces were wooden, but the fuselage was based on a reliable framework of steel tubes. Two Armstrong Siddeley Cheetah 5 engines with an output of 270 horsepower each turned metal two-bladed fixed-pitch Ferry Reed propellers. The landing gear deserves special attention. The main wheels retracted forward into the engine nacelles using a manual winch via a chain drive and a fine-pitch screw mechanism. To fully retract the landing gear, the pilot had to turn the handle as many as 140 times. The aircraft carried only 4 passengers, and each of them had their own personal round window. The crew consisted of 2 people, and the cockpit was equipped with dual controls. At the beginning of 1934, the English Air Ministry announced a competition to create a patrol aircraft for the Royal Air Force. No excessively high demands were placed on the flight performance of a machine with such a designation. What was needed, first and foremost, was a simple and reliable aircraft capable of leisurely surveying coastal waters at low altitude, remaining in a designated patrol area for a long time. Contestants presented a number of designs, and among them on May 19th was the Avro 652A. This was a militarized version of that very same projected civil machine, but now with more powerful Cheetah 6 engines of 295 horsepower, an armament of 2 machine guns, and a small bomb load. After reviewing the projects, the ministry ordered the construction of 2 experimental machines, the Avro 652A and the de Havilland DH-89M. The latter, by the way, was also a modification of the passenger biplane Dragon Rapide. Both aircraft were to be ready in March 1935. Meanwhile, the first civil Avro 652 took to the air on January 1, 1935 at the Woodford Airfield. It was piloted by test pilot F. Tompkins, who immediately noted the machine's good controllability and stability. Following the first aircraft, which received the name Avalon, a second was soon assembled, Avatar, which was later called simply Ava. On March 11th, they were officially handed over to the customer, Imperial Airways. The company put them on the Croydon to Brindisi line, where they flew right up until 1939. Then Avalon and Ava were sold to the Air Service Training Company as training aircraft for the preparation of civil aviation pilots. In February 1941, already during the war, they were requisitioned by the Air Force. These machines managed to serve in several flight schools and were even stationed for some time in a combat unit, the 811th Squadron of Coastal Command. From then on, the Avro firm focused all its efforts specifically on the military variant. The first prototype of the Avro 652A was assembled as planned in March 1935. Already on March 24th, this aircraft took to the air for the first time. Pilot B. Thorne was at the controls. The military variant differed quite noticeably from its civilian counterpart. A bulky Armstrong Whitworth upper turret appeared for a Lewis machine gun, the same as on the Whitley bomber. Round portholes were installed instead of rectangular windows, and the engine cowlings became characteristically ribbed. The armament was strengthened with a second Browning-type machine gun, which was mounted in the nose of the fuselage on the port side. The bomb load was placed under the cockpit floor in the center section. The standard variant provided for the suspension of 2 100-pound bombs and another 4 of 20 pounds each. In addition, the aircraft could carry flares and signal smoke buoys. The crew initially consisted of 3 people. In April, the machine underwent rigorous testing at the Aviation Center in Martlesham. Based on the testers' recommendations, the designers increased the stabilizer span by approximately 1/4, while simultaneously reducing the area of the elevators. In May, official comparative trials of the Avro 652A and its competitor, the DH89M, took place in Gosport. The latter was smaller in dimensions, inferior in speed, and especially in flight endurance. The Avro firm won the competition. On May 25th, the aircraft was officially accepted into service with the Royal Air Force under the name Anson 1, in honor of an 18th century English admiral, and an order was later issued for 174 production examples. This was a landmark moment. The Anson became the first modern monoplane in service with the English Air Force, and at the same time, their first aircraft with retractable landing gear. Already on June 29th, the novelty was shown to the public at the Air Parade in Hindon. After the conclusion of the competition, the parallel development of another project, which was a somewhat scaled-down version of the Anson, was stopped, focusing entirely on refining the winner. Based on the test results, it was decided to introduce 38 changes to the design. These included the installation of more powerful Cheetah 9 engines of 350 horsepower, as well as a change to the cockpit glazing. It was raised higher and its area increased, forming a continuous strip of windows. The horizontal tail surfaces were also lengthened even further, and the rudder's horn balance was replaced with a mass balance. The latter innovation was tested on the prototype in September 1935. Incidentally, the civilian Ava and Avalon aircraft were modified in a similar way. The first production Anson 1 rolled out of the workshop at the Woodford factory right before the New Year, on December 31st. In February 1936, the 48th Squadron in Manston received the first machines of this type, and as early as March 6th, it was officially declared combat-ready. In the same year, Avro received a new order for another 135 aircraft. The machines of this batch had their differences: metal aileron frames instead of the old wooden ones, and a new, less sloped cockpit windscreen with a direct vision window on the left side. Such aircraft were built from 1938, and a little later Schrenk landing flaps began to be installed on them as well. Meanwhile, interest in the Anson was also shown abroad. Australia ordered the first 12 machines. They were assembled and shipped by November, but the Australians immediately demanded another 36. The last 10 of these had an interesting feature. Unlike the British aircraft, they were equipped with a special, improved set of Sperry instruments for blind flying. Later, aircraft of this type were also purchased as trainers. In total, by the beginning of the war, Australia had received 82 Anson aircraft. 3 aircraft from the later series were sent to Finland, and 1 was sold to Estonia. This aircraft, produced in October 1937, received the number 158 in Estonia. Together with other equipment of the Estonian Air Force, in 1940 it ended up with the Red Army. Unlike many other former Estonian aircraft, it did not go to the scrap heap, but entered the aviation squadron of the 22nd Territorial Corps of the Red Army, and together with it met the beginning of the war in the Baltics. Unfortunately, nothing is known about its further fate. In October 1936, one unarmed machine was ferried to Egypt. There, it was planned to be tested to decide whether it was worth purchasing this type for a bomber transport squadron of the local Air Force. This aircraft was officially designated as the Anson II, as it had a number of differences from the Combat Mark I. For example, its entrance door was located on the port side, like on its civilian predecessors Ava and Avalon, and not on the right, as on the military machines. This specimen remained the only one of its kind. Later, requests for the Anson arrived quite frequently from abroad. Starting from March 1937, 4 aircraft were sent to Ireland, where they equipped a patrol flight of the Coast Guard. 25 aircraft were ordered by the Turks, but by the beginning of the Second World War, they managed to send them only 6. The rest were requisitioned by the British Air Force. In June 1939, 12 aircraft flew to Greece. Later, they took part in combat operations against the Italian army. After Germany's entry into the war against Greece in April 1941, some of the aircraft fell into the hands of the Germans, while a few machines managed to escape to Egypt, where they were used by the English. In the years 1938 and 39, the Royal Air Force gifted several Ansons to Iraq. Ironically, they were destroyed by a strike of none other than English aviation on an Iraqi airfield on May 2, 1941, during the rebellion of Rashid Ali, who was supported by the Germans. But the lion's share of all machines of this type produced by Avro and Company went to the Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force, created in 1936. The simple and reliable aircraft was gaining ever wider distribution there. On June 26, 1937, at the air parade in Hendon, 5 full Anson squadrons sailed in formation over the heads of the spectators. By the beginning of 1939, 12 squadrons were already armed with these machines. Aircraft of later production differed slightly from the early ones in terms of equipment. In particular, the Lewis machine gun, located in the upper turret, was replaced by the more modern Vickers K. Due to the new equipment and the increase of the crew to 4 people, the takeoff weight increased to 8,000 pounds. This was noticeably more compared to the prototype. By 1939, the Anson was already ceasing to satisfy the requirements of Coastal Command, primarily in terms of operating range. In May, the first Lockheed Hudson-type aircraft began to arrive from the United States, which significantly surpassed the machine from Avro and Company in speed and by almost 3 times in range. The Hudson, also made on the basis of the passenger airliner Lockheed 14 Super Electra, belonged to a completely different generation. All-metal construction, powerful engines, a well-mechanized wing, and excellent radio and instrument equipment. However, despite this, 11 squadrons of Coastal Command met the war precisely on the good old Ansons. Most sources indicate that the first to encounter the enemy were 2 Ansons from the 233rd Squadron, which attacked a German submarine on September 5, 1939. However, recent research paints a completely different picture. There were 2 boats, and what is most interesting, both of them were English. Fortunately, the pilots missed, but 2 bombs dropped at low altitude ricocheted off the surface of the sea and exploded in the air, damaging one of the patrol machines with shrapnel. With punctured tanks, it did not reach the shore and landed on the water, and the crew had to use an inflatable dinghy. However, on the same day, another Anson from the 500th Squadron did indeed correct the situation, actually sinking a German submarine near the southeastern coast of England. In the years 1939 and 40, these seemingly obsolete machines made a considerable contribution to convoy escort, the search and destruction of submarines, and rescue operations. The Anson was a sturdy and quite durable aircraft, although weak defensive armament. The absence of armor protection for the crew and the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks made themselves felt. However, in the open sea, they encountered fighters infrequently, and regarding larger enemy aircraft, they sometimes even displayed aggressiveness, attacking much better armed German bombers and seaplanes. For example, on November 8, 1939, a lone Anson attacked 2 Dornier Do-18 flying boats and shot one of them down. On the combat score of Anson crews are also listed a Heinkel, He-111 bomber, a twin-engine floatplane Heinkel, He-115, as well as one more machine, which was shot down so quickly that the English pilots did not even have time to identify it. Occasionally, they managed to successfully fend off fighter aircraft as well. In June 1940, 3 Ansons over the English Channel were overtaken by a flight of 9 Bf-109s. But the English not only escaped undefeated, 2 wounded in such a situation practically does not count, but they themselves downed 2 Messerschmitts into the sea and damaged a third. In July of that same year, an Anson crew, spotting a quartet of Bf-110s strafing English minesweepers, drew the enemy's attention to themselves and met them with dignity. The very first fighter that approached from the side ran into a point-blank burst and fell. Nevertheless, the aircraft's firepower was clearly insufficient. Therefore, units mounted additional machine guns in the cockpit windows, fired by the navigator. These firing points partially covered the blind spots in the forward hemisphere. The commander of No. 500 Squadron went even further with his aircraft and installed a 20mm Hispano cannon firing downwards and backwards through a hatch in the fuselage. During the evacuation from Dunkirk, it was used quite effectively to fire upon German torpedo boats. Some pilots followed the commander's example and modified their aircraft in a similar manner. An interesting fact, when firing the cannon in bursts, the Anson speed increased by approximately 6 miles per hour. In the second half of 1940, mass deliveries of Hudsons allowed the patrol squadrons to be largely re-equipped with new machinery. This process was completed in 1941. Finally, the permissible bomb load for the Anson was increased to 500 pounds. They usually carried 2 depth charges of 250 pounds each. With this, the aircraft's takeoff weight reached 9,300 pounds. They continued to fly over the sea until 1942, but now as part of the Air Force Air-Sea Rescue Squadrons. Some of them were equipped with ASV radars for detecting surface targets. Similar modifications were also carried out in Australia. However, by this time, the primary field of application for the Anson had long since become training units. Soon after the adoption of the Joint Training Plan of the Air Forces of the British Commonwealth countries in December 1939, this aircraft was selected as the standard multi-engine trainer. Reliable, economical, cheap, and simple to the point of primitiveness, the Anson was well suited for these purposes. The majority of the training aircraft had no armament. In total, almost 2,500 Ansons of the first model were assembled without machine guns. Specifically without machine guns, as the turret dome was usually retained, it was very convenient for training navigators in celestial navigation. Another 313 aircraft were produced for training airgunners, featuring hydraulically operated Bristol B-1 Mark VI turrets from the Blenheim bomber. With the new turret, the aircraft weighed 9,675 pounds, which was already too much for the low-powered engines. The engines often overheated. Consequently, smooth cylindrical cowlings were installed on some machines to provide better cooling. These were modeled after the cowlings of the Airspeed Oxford aircraft. Training Anson 1s, produced in the years 1940 to 1942, had landing lights in the wings instead of the single nose light installed previously. Some of the aircraft had additional blisters above the navigator station and were equipped with various types of radio compasses. In 1939, the Air Force issued an order for 1,500 aircraft, and subsequently for another 800. In 1943, a powerful new factory in Chatterton joined the production effort. The Anson remained the primary training aircraft for pilots, navigators, and bomber gunners throughout the entire war. Exports also continued during the hostilities. In addition to those previously delivered, another 40 aircraft were sent to Australia in 1939 and 1940. 3 bomber squadrons flew these machines there. Australian Ansons took part in the war in the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. The local Air Force used them for coastal patrol and later as training and light transport aircraft. They served in this role throughout the war and then remained in storage until 1948. The last of them was decommissioned as late as 1963. A number of aircraft went to the Union of South Africa. They were used to equip 1 squadron and 3 separate flights that were previously armed with converted passenger Junkers Ju 86s. They were also used for patrol duties. Interestingly, 1 Anson in South Africa was fitted with floats. It was stationed at an airbase as a non-flying instructional seaplane. From the second half of the war, the Anson began to be actively used as a light transport as well. Initially, these were disarmed machines removed from combat squadrons. Several such were even transferred to American units based in England. But eventually, special versions appeared. The first was the Mark X modification, released in 1943. This was an Anson 1 with a reinforced cabin floor for transporting cargo. Since such machines were regarded as dual-purpose aircraft, trainer transports, some of them retained armament, specifically Bristol turrets. The last Anson 10s were assembled with smooth, round cowlings. In 1944, special military transport variants were released. Modifications 11 and 12. It was intended that they would be used as staff, liaison, ambulance, and light cargo aircraft. The Anson 11, which made its first flight on July 30, 1944, differed externally from the 1 by the increased height of the cabin. Cheetah 19 engines and smooth cowlings turned Ferry Reed metal propellers. On this model, hydraulic actuation for the landing gear and flaps was introduced for the first time on English Ansons. On Canadian versions, this had been done 3 years earlier. A little later, on October 27th, the first Anson 12 took to the air. It was distinguished by its power plant, Cheetah 15 engines of 420 horsepower with Rotoll propellers. Late series Anson 12s were produced with all-metal wings. All of them were operated in Great Britain, with the exception of 1 aircraft sent after the war to Australia. A significant contribution to production during the Second World War was made by Canadian factories. In July 1940, the Government of Canada entrusted the Federal Aircraft firm with mastering the production of machines of this type for training purposes. The design of the aircraft was modified to suit the components and technologies available in Canada. The result was the Anson II modification. The first experimental machine took off on August 21, 1941. Federal Aircraft converted it from an original brought from England. It was powered by American Jacobs L6MB engines of 330 horsepower each. From its English brethren, the aircraft also differed in modified glazing, a molded nose section made of plywood impregnated with synthetic resins, a different landing gear design, and introduced hydraulic actuation. In total, 1,050 Anson IIs were manufactured. 50 of them in 1943 were transferred to the United States Army Air Forces under the designation AT-20. They were fitted with Jacobs R915-7 engines. English factories also built aircraft for Canada with the same Jacobs engines. The batch released with them received the designation Anson III. Another 223 machines were manufactured with Wright R760. E1 Whirlwind motors with a capacity of 300 horsepower. This was the Anson IV modification. In 1942, the Anson V appeared on the assembly lines of Canadian factories. Instead of continuous strips of glazing, separate round windows were introduced here. But the main change was elsewhere. The fuselage was now manufactured entirely as a plywood shell, a monocoque, without a load-bearing steel truss. Armament was not installed on them. This modification was produced in huge quantities, 1,070 units, by 3 firms at once: Federal Aircraft, Canadian Car and Foundry, and McDonald Brothers Aircraft. On its basis, a variant for training airgunners was also released, the Anson VI with a Bristol turret. In both cases, motors of the Pratt & Whitney R985 AN12B Wasp Junior type, with a capacity of 450 horsepower with fixed-pitch Hamilton or Hoover propellers were installed. The 5th model was operated by the Canadian Air Force right up until the end of the 1950s. After the end of the war, the Anson I was withdrawn from the armament of the British Air Force, and a significant part of them was sold abroad. Thus, they ended up in the ranks of the military aviation of Belgium, Egypt, Iran, Israel, Norway, Portugal, and Saudi Arabia. Dutch pilots who served in England in the No. 320th Squadron during the war, returning home, arrived on several Anson Is, which were then used to revive the Air Force of the Netherlands. In addition to them, the government of this country bought another 10 aircraft from military surpluses. In a similar manner, one Anson 12, or possibly 10, ended up in Czechoslovakia together with a Spitfire squadron. The largest buyer turned out to be France, which received 223 machines. In the first post-war years, these aircraft were used in flight schools, in naval aviation for coastal patrol, as well as in colonial squadrons in Syria and Africa. Many Ansons of various modifications were sold to private firms, in total over 300 aircraft. Cheap, simple, economical, and undemanding of airfields, they settled well on local airlines and in remote regions. In Kenya, they fought locusts. In Scotland, they delivered mail. In Denmark, they worked as flying ambulances. The Anson gained particularly wide usage in countries of the British Commonwealth, former colonies, and protectorates. In Uganda, Singapore, Bahrain, and Jordan, this small, unpretentious aircraft could often be met until the early 1960s. They were converted into passenger planes, cargo planes without windows, such as those owned by the Transair Company in England, flying laboratories, and training machines for civil aviation. The firm Echo Electronics, for example, used one machine for testing aviation radars up to 1967. Similar modifications were also operated by Decca, Smiths Instruments, Hawker, and other companies. Using production capacities that had grown during the war years and established mass production technology, Avro and Company rushed to conquer the local airline aircraft market after peace was established in Europe. By that time, the products of the de Havilland firm, primarily the Dragon Rapide biplanes, dominated almost monopolistically in Great Britain. To compete with them, a refined civil variant of the Anson 12 was prepared at the very end of the war, released for sale under the commercial brand Avro 19. It had improved sound insulation, a reworked cabin with 9 seats, replaced the continuous glazing on the sides with oval portholes, and returned the entrance door to the left side, just like in the very first prototype. The first Avro 19 flew in January 1945. Serial production was conducted by the factory in Greengate. The Railway Air Services Company bought 14 aircraft and released them on the London-Belfast and Liverpool-Belfast lines. It was followed by Scottish Aviation and other airlines. Just like on the Anson 12, an all-metal wing and tail assembly were gradually introduced on the civil Avro 19 as well. Machines of this type received the name Series 2. Under the index Anson C-19, this modification entered service with the Royal Air Force. A small number of these aircraft also served in the military aviation of other countries. 2 ended up in Australia, 4 were bought by the Irish Army Air Corps, and 12 by the Afghan police. The latter differed slightly from the C-19, so they were assigned their own name, the Anson 18. Mass production of the 19th model lasted until 1947. In total, 263 such machines were built, the majority of which belonged to the second, metal series. Based on the C-19, several specialized types of training aircraft were created. The Anson T-20 was a training bomber with a glazed nose section and a bomb sight. The T-21 served as a flying navigation classroom. It was actively used in southern Rhodesia. And the T-22 was intended for training radio operators. It was the T-22, released in 1952, that became the last development in the large Anson family. In total, as many as 38 modifications appeared. The last physically manufactured aircraft was a T-21, which was handed over to the Air Force in May of that same year. The Anson remained on the assembly line for 17 years, a duration that is not a record, but one that commands respect. In total, during these years, the factories released 11,020 aircraft of all modifications. Of these, over 8,000 were manufactured by the firm Avro and Company itself, and the rest, almost 3,000, were added in Canada. However, long after being withdrawn from production, it remained in service with the British Air Force. The last Anson C-19 was solemnly retired on June 28, 1968. That same year, the veteran took part in the last war of its long career. 6 ambulance aircraft were used in the Civil War in Nigeria. Thus, this aircraft, which seemed unpretentious at first glance, lived a long and quite interesting life. It served for 34 years in the English Air Force alone. It did not demonstrate records, nor did it have loud combat successes. It simply reliably and faithfully did its work where it was needed. In England, this machine is still remembered and honored. 6 Ansons of various modifications and years of production are preserved in different museums across the country.